that I left unlisted. As I'm doing my walk, knowing, feeling, realizing that the carnal release through order that most people infer or see as death is very close to me. And yet it's not a bleak, sad moment in realization. Cyclically, it's a part of the fabric of everything. Championing in ways that most don't contemplate or understand. But the ontology, the higher form, the higher man is invariably coming into being. And I'm very pleased that I was an integral aspect, at least from where I can see, from the junction point that I'm viewing from. And we always know this is a heavily parallaxed view. Women. They seem complex. But the complexity is what's missing. It seems like a conundrum. But in fact, a female, human female, is a propaganda piece. When we go back and we look at, when we talk about Mother Cersei, the Lady of the Wood, we want to give men something to aspire to. Yet, from an organic perspective, she is not enough. How do you keep the offspring, the production of failed man, the consumer, the heir, pumping out at an ever-increasing production value? Like here before you, you have the item of interest. It's us. Not as individuals per se, but as a collective. That one of us doesn't hold much value, much like cattle, but in the utilization of our various parts, and not to mention the most valuable, which is the matrix that men make. The energy, or the luch as people like to call it, that we emanate. And that this lesser magic, this lesser Solomonic or Enochian magic, supplicating back to the whore, which is, let's describe it, it is the Dionysian-thelemic enjoyment of sexual pleasures, as Lilith is described at the Red Sea, pleasuring herself constantly and giving off countless demonic offspring. That she would be the progenitor of this original order. That she would feel all the offspring and all the future within her glandular system that now has been reduced into a somewhat finite order of as the individual must collectively come together, birds of a feather flock together, in order to experience this midwifing event. She finds her place in the ontology, in the Wicca, in the Luciferianism, in the art of deception. Man is supposed to be confused, right? He is the son of woman. He's not the son of man. He's the son of woman. In other words, he does not value the highest esteemable egoic principle that we find, that I put up as the parabolic inference. That you have a line of distinction and equidistance, you come up with a U-shaped pattern where the vertical line, the horizontal line, through succession of the energetics in sequence, form the parabola of the U-shaped altar, that which could also be looked at as the V, right? Because in its basin, there is the collected energy. It has no place left to go. So what's left out under that line of distinction, the equatorial line, is, in fact, the V. The V for vendetta, as they say, right? Vagina. The very conical birth canal, where energy has no other place to go. So, in not recognizing man as the king, right, but as the egoic self, the flamboyant egoic self, we see how that's even steeped into the depths of the cat kingdom and the shrinking down of the cat and the capitulation of the lion to the lioness. I saw the other day this lioness go up to a lion after he was sort of swatting away one of the cubs, and she walked all the way up to the lion and then smacked him in the face. Most people would laugh at this. I know I did. That little chuckle. But what are we laughing at? Are we laughing at what we would say is instant karma's going to get you? Instant mama's going to get you? Or is it that we want the violence to take place in the physical action, but we don't want to see how that violence is taught and culminates in the cub, in the lion cub? So we get into the idea of the overman, Übermensch, the higher man. There is the higher man, as Jason Risa Giorgiani points out this distinction, and then there is the overman, the Übermensch, right? That there is a difference there. Because in culminate, the higher man, through generations of succession, will invariably, inadvertently, but through generations, mathematically, produce this offspring. And it follows its own number subset. Right? So when you get down into the gematria, when you're looking at numerology, when you're looking at a time-space sequence of events, the I am become becomes the statement that no shame, no justification, no obedience, no honor to the Ouroboros, the Ouroboros cycle, is necessary. In other words, permission from the mother, right, from Hathor, is not necessary. And we see depicted on Hathor's head this exact symbol, that we have this basin. We have the crucible that traps in the energy. Right? But then there's the hyperbolic aspect, the X, and how men display the X as the four main principles. That you have the same equidistance, right, from a main frame or a main source, But now you don't have the delineation or the distinction of a sort of line of scrimmage, right? You have the equidistance from essentially the X or the cross that heavily infers a rotary effect, right? Because you have the zodiacal aspects. Because once you have these four main principles, you are now able to sustainably not maintain the ovum, which is more of a teardrop or a mystic monad, right? Almost like what a sphere would look like in travel, but really a Prince Rupert drop prior to its collapsing into itself or protecting itself, both or neither, right? You don't have something that's eternal. You have something there where you have to take the purity and sacrifice it. And what's happening is, this sounds benign, and it sounds like just an enjoyable religion on the surface, making love, eyes wide shut, right? Enjoying the aspects of the carnal. But then you get into the offspring that is sacrificed, the CP, right? The SA, all of the other things that are required in order to state this at an even higher gradient as the resonance of this return, this plastic elastic return back to the structural components and principle are demanded. So it's just buying time. It's deferred. It's debts that are deferred that finally fall on, again, I've thought about this a lot today, just Jefferson, famous words, paraphrasing, that we would wake up on the beaches, homeless, destitute, skillless, on the lands, the very lands that our forefathers fought and died for. So now what we're looking at is we're seeing that it is the production, right, of the reduced man as human, as the man woman. We have nipples, women have clitoris. The clitoris obviously grows when you turn up that dial, when you turn up the testosterone. Put a man on Lupron, watch his genitals shrink, tuck back into his body, right? And watch what happens there, where the breast tissue starts increasing, the nipples start to take on more sensitivity and dominance, estrogen and progesterone start to rise. So you have this idea, this dichotomy of a chiral position, but they're set on a dial, right, that can be modified. So you have to get back into base principles, not principles that are of the male component or the female component, but what we are being taught by the failure of the Rosicrucians and the Rosicrucian cross, that really is represented as lying on one side that is not balanced, right? Is, do you have the physicality of the hermaphrodite, or do you have the sexless, purified state of being, right? I think none of us want to return back into the distinction of this so-called progeneration that 𝕯𝖏𝖕𝖕𝖘 pointed out prior to his death, I believe in like 2020. Might have been before that. But he was the so-called really last spiritual chief of the Zulu, right? Where he was passing on the stories and the traditions and really looking at the story of the reptilian, the original hermaphrodite being that was humanity, but was it humanity from a certain subset or sect of peoples? Because then we get into the fact that we have several different offerings that could invariably come together and begin to start this hybrid breeding process where strengths and weaknesses are pointed out. And of course, the man rejected the Messiah rejected, the spiritual leader, the spiritual king, would not be seen or recognized or celebrated as anything, right? He doesn't have this huge phallus. He doesn't have this need to conquer, destroy, and kill, right? He has the unyielding, relentless pursuit within him to restore order back to its purified state. So you get into what is reflected and talked about with the story of Adam, Abel, Cain, Seth, right? You have these active principles that are displayed through the physicality. One does not want to raise and slaughter animals. The other willingly does it. One does not want to eat the wheat of the land, so to speak, and cower or bow before a certain god, right? We're talking about Cain. He will take on the pursuits of himself and his own godhead and pursue things in a very deterministic, stoic, yet aggressive, warlike mannerism in metallurgy, but he will enjoy himself in all the pleasures of being this self-proclaimed higher man. Or is he? Does he merely become the mason that doesn't really have the intellect, but has the drive? Must always be the manager, must always be the boss. But the boss of what? The manager of what? Whatever, from a Stoic perspective, whatever principles are present, that's what you go with. You don't try to better it. You work with what you have from a Stoic perspective, right? And then you have what would be considered the weaker man by this Cain figure in this Tubal-Cain line of succession, which is the more Zoroastrian esoteric man. Yet their young Sadi, the Zoroaster, was raised doing the most noble pursuit as a keeper of the stables, rearing and raising the horses. That's hard work with his father, right? For nobility, right? So he knew all things he lived around the horses, the driving force, the power. You could say the Trojan horse that was used, right? The unicorn, the dragon, the celebrated animated aspect of the ontology and nature and the mysticism that surrounds the horse. Because eventually, when everything breaks down, one Carrington event away from having to go back to the utilization of horsepower, right? We even use that term today. So, getting back to this, Eve deceived Adam, Lilith deceived Adam, and much like that Appalachian outsiders that I was discussing, you've got a genealogy that some say, in a crude way, looks more like a pole, where it's like, this is your cousin, this is your second cousin, this is your sister, and really, you could judge until you see the offspring and go, okay, it didn't turn out too bad, right? It's got a way of rectifying itself, but you have enough scattered. You have enough to get away from the whole Habsburg. It's that the lineage isn't too tight to where by the 23rd generation it all falls apart, right? So this interbreeding that's then seen as a sin, and then you're supposed to internalize this and say, oh, I have sinned. And then when you look at the law over time, the law states, no, like all law, that over time, no, you didn't sin. You were just not following the conformist measures of the time, wherein Black's Law Dictionary, 𝕯𝖏𝖕𝖘𝖙𝖊𝖗 literature, the witches' covens, coteries, disbursement of the civic aspects of the law. So it's the people. So when you're no longer supplicating to the consensus, to the people, and the people are not the eye of the beholder, and you are a breakaway, well, they think you have to justify a higher natural ontology or order. And that order is EPL. It's esoteric principles of light. It's the purity and the purification. So actually the law is set against the lawmakers. The principles that the progeneration prior to law that say that law doesn't exist at all, and that law should have never been established because they're deviations away from the pure source of the pure center, and that you should have taught purity to your offspring. And if you couldn't, then you didn't understand purity, and therefore you were inept, feckless, unabecedary, or an abecedary, right? In the sense of learning the ABCs. You were actually teaching and proselytizing a false directive, in other words. Right, so we get into the endpoints of the parabolic or the hyperbolic shape, the aspect. Form follows function, function into form. And we see that I am become is a statement of I don't need to justify myself through the lower action of these edicts, tenets, and quasi principles that you infer as law. So, in my opinion, it may have been a false directive, but in the 13 that emerge with Jesus, right, sometimes as the figurehead in this cult, right, or you could even stretch and say coven, right, that you have, or coven, like a covenant, right, because the witches put the K at the end of magic, right? The witches pronounce things in such a way. It's very distinct because it gets back into Theban alphabet. And the very premise that many of these quasi-religions follow, right? But there is one religion and it keeps on. So much so that then you have this disparate segmentation of people throughout times in history where if you even go back 500 years, you wouldn't even understand or be able to communicate very well with people. The dialectical pattern, the tempo, the principal adherence in language, they would absolutely not understand you. The metabolism of the people is entirely removed and different, right? So you have these different substrates of human. But getting back into the origin, the progeneration of the original form, you go beyond Edward Kelly and John Dee and Bruno to where and even David Hume, where you go past the monad, or behold the sign, right? You go past the monad and you come closer to the pure source or the pure center, beyond materia prima, right? Because this is, in essence, like Allegro's sacred or really mystic mushroom, that you have this very sexualized theme, a celebration of the sexuality and the procreation. But you have done nothing but procreate in your own pleasure, and you have signed against yourself, the true self, the return back to the one self, right? That gets very much into many religions. Like you could even trace it toward the imperialist versions of Hinduism, where you begin to see animism emerge in Bali Islands, and you start to look at all these island communities and how there is a reverence toward this Wiccan lore, right? But you want to think that was just a natural progress or procession of survival, but it wasn't. Cultivation and a mechanistic aspect was always being manipulated, right? And we see this as all of these attributions of, breaks off, because you start to see direct information that leads back to things like this, UFOs, straight up, and phenomenon of interference, right? Interference with the weather, interference with natural patterns. So there's an interference with nature. So there's something very unnatural about nature.